The biggest mistake the HOA ever made wasn't sending me a bill. It was reminding me to open a safe they hoped would stay forgotten forever. The envelope was waiting on my front porch when I finished tightening the last brass screw on the restored dock railing. The fresh scent of cedar mixed with lake water drifting across the shoreline. And for the first time in almost 2 years, I felt like I could finally breathe. The old mansion behind me no longer looked abandoned. Sunlight reflected across the restored bay windows. The slate roof gleamed after months of careful work. Every porch column stood perfectly straight again. Every piece of handcrafted trim matched photographs taken half a century earlier, and the weathered boathouse that everyone had written off as beyond saving now looked like something worthy of a magazine cover. I wiped the sawdust from my hands before picking up the thick, cream-colored envelope. The return address carried the familiar green logo of the Pine Hollow Shores Homeowners Association. Funny thing was, nobody from that HOA had spoken a single word to me during the 23 months I spent rebuilding the property. Not when I hauled out rotted beams. Not when I replaced broken windows one by one. Not when I spent freezing mornings standing ankle-deep in lake water repairing the dock supports. They watched from a distance. They drove past in polished SUVs. They never offered help, never welcomed me, never complained. Until the house looked valuable again. The paper inside felt unusually heavy. The first page read, "Notice of Outstanding Community Obligations." Beneath that sat a number so ridiculous I actually laughed out loud. $238,000 for $116.82. According to the HOA, I owed every unpaid assessment dating back to 1974, along with compounded interest, penalties, administrative fees, legal expenses, preservation assessments, and something they called historical compliance charges. 52 years of dues for a homeowners association that had ignored this place while raccoons lived in the attic and vines swallowed the front porch. I thought it had to be a printing error until another vehicle rolled slowly into my gravel driveway. A spotless white Lexus stopped beside the mailbox, and out stepped Linda Ashcroft, dressed like she was arriving for a charity luncheon instead of delivering the most absurd demand letter I'd ever seen. Her smile never quite reached her eyes. "Congratulations, Ethan," she said, looking past me toward the mansion instead of at me. "You've added tremendous value to our community." She paused just long enough to let those words settle before tapping the envelope in my hand with one perfectly manicured finger. "Now it's time to pay your fair share." I looked from her to the house, then back to the invoice. The breeze carried the smell of fresh varnish from the porch railing I'd finished less than 10 minutes earlier. Somewhere across the lake, a loon called into the afternoon silence. Everything around me felt peaceful except for the woman standing on my driveway pretending this was normal. "Interesting," I said quietly. "I never knew this property belonged to your HOA." She smiled even wider. "Oh, it always has." There was something rehearsed about the way she answered, like she'd practiced those 4 words in front of a mirror. Then she climbed back into her Lexus and drove away without another sentence, leaving dust hanging over the gravel road. I stood there staring at the envelope again, my thumb tracing the faded edge of the paper while something tugged at the back of my memory. Down in the mansion's basement sat an old steel safe wedged into the original stone foundation. I discovered it 6 months earlier behind a warped wall panel, but the rusted lock refused to budge, and with a restoration deadline hanging over my head, I'd pushed it aside for another day. As the afternoon sun reflected across the quiet lake, I realized something that made the invoice feel less like a bill and more like a clue. Linda hadn't just demanded money. She'd accidentally reminded me that some secrets wait decades for exactly the wrong person to come looking for them. I did not buy that mansion because it was a smart investment. Every experienced contractor I knew told me to walk away. The inspection report listed foundation settlement, extensive water damage, failing electrical systems, a collapsed section of the roof, and enough code violations to fill a filing cabinet. The realtor even joked that I was purchasing a very expensive demolition project with a beautiful lake attached. Maybe she was right. The first morning I walked through the front door, every step stirred decades of dust into the cold air. The smell of damp wood, rusted pipes, and old fireplace ash settled into my clothes before I had even reached the grand staircase. Rainwater dripped steadily through a cracked skylight, echoing across the empty ballroom with a rhythm that sounded almost like a clock counting down. Most people saw a haunted ruin. I saw craftsmanship that deserved another chance. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and restoring forgotten homes has been my career for almost 20 years. My father built custom homes across northern Michigan, and my grandfather repaired historic churches after returning from military service. They taught me that old buildings carry memories the same way old people carry stories. You just have to be patient enough to listen. That lesson followed me through every restoration project I ever accepted, but none of them compared to this mansion. Built in the early 1970s by a wealthy developer named Charles Hawthorne, the estate had once been the pride of the entire shoreline. Then Charles died unexpectedly. Ownership changed hands several times, legal disputes piled up, taxes fell behind, and eventually everyone simply forgot the place existed. Nature moved in without asking permission. Ivy climbed the limestone walls. Tree roots pushed beneath the cracked driveway. Ducks nested beneath the broken dock every spring. Local kids invented ghost stories about strange lights in the upstairs windows. Even delivery drivers avoided the property after sunset. That only made me want it more. Every paycheck from previous projects disappeared into this restoration. I refinished hardwood floors one board at a time. I spent entire weekends rebuilding original window frames instead of replacing them with modern vinyl. I searched antique shops across 3 states to find matching brass hardware for doors that had not opened properly in decades. Some nights, I worked until 2 in the morning with nothing but portable work lights reflecting across the lake, while crickets chirped in the darkness and the scent of fresh sawdust drifted through the empty halls. Neighbors occasionally slowed their cars to watch, but almost nobody stopped to introduce themselves. The only thing they seemed interested in was whether I would eventually give up like everyone else before me. I never did. About 6 months into the project, while removing damaged shelving in the basement wine cellar, my pry bar struck solid steel hidden behind a false wooden panel. After clearing away years of dirt and loose mortar, I uncovered an old floor safe anchored deep into the original stone foundation. Its heavy combination dial was frozen with rust, and the thick door refused to move even after hours of careful work. I figured it probably contained forgotten paperwork, or maybe nothing at all. With inspections approaching and contractors already scheduled for the following week, I covered it again and promised myself I would come back after the restoration was finished. Standing on my restored front porch now, holding that impossible invoice in my hands, I could not shake the feeling that the old safe and the sudden appearance of the Homeowners Association were connected in a way I did not yet understand. The next morning the lake looked as calm as polished glass, but the peace ended the moment I heard tires crunch across my gravel driveway. This time it was not one luxury vehicle. It was 3. A white Lexus led the way, followed by a black sport utility vehicle carrying 2 members of the Homeowners Association board and another pickup pulling a small trailer loaded with bright green signposts. They parked as if they had been invited. Linda Ashcroft stepped out carrying a leather binder tucked neatly beneath her arm. Even from 20 feet away, I could smell her expensive perfume mixing awkwardly with the fresh scent of pine and damp earth surrounding the property. She smiled with the confidence of someone who believed the conversation had already been won. Before it started, "Beautiful work," she said while slowly looking across the restored porch, the new cedar railings, and the freshly painted columns. "You have transformed this place into the crown jewel of Pine Hollow Shores." I thanked her politely, hoping that would be enough to end the visit. Instead, she opened her binder and slid several color maps across the hood of her Lexus. Every page had my property outlined with bright yellow marker. "Now that the estate is fully restored," she continued, "we need to bring everything into compliance with community standards." Those words sounded harmless until she began listing them one by one. My private dock would require annual HOA certification. The exterior paint color needed board approval even though it matched the original photographs from the 1970s. Future landscaping would require written permission. The stone pathway leading to the lake would have to remain open for emergency neighborhood access. Then came the sentence that made me stop listening. She pointed toward the shoreline and casually said, "Of course, the community has always enjoyed limited access to this section of the lake." I looked at the water, then back at her. "That has never happened since I bought this property." Her smile never moved. "Perhaps not recently. One of the board members began unloading the green signpost from the trailer, while another measured the edge of my driveway with a tape measure. I walked over before they could place anything into the ground. The sign read, "Future Community Lake Access." I laughed because the alternative was losing my temper. "You are not putting that on my property." Linda folded her hands calmly. "Technically, this has always been shared community frontage." I asked her to show me the recorded easement. She flipped through several pages without producing a single document. Instead, she handed me another packet containing architectural guidelines, monthly assessment schedules, parking regulations, and an application requiring retroactive approval for restoration work that had already passed every county inspection. As she spoke, I noticed something strange. Whenever I asked for original legal documents, her eyes shifted away for just a second before returning to that polished smile. She answered every direct question with another policy, another rule, or another brochure, but never with actual proof. Before leaving, she stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and glanced toward the mansion. "It is wonderful that someone finally saved this house," she said softly. "It would be unfortunate if legal complications prevented you from enjoying it." Then they drove away, leaving the unused signposts stacked beside the trailer because I refused to let them install a single one. I stood alone in the quiet again, listening to wind ripple across the lake, replaying every word she had spoken. Something about her confidence felt unnatural. She acted less like someone enforcing rules and more like someone trying to convince herself that a story repeated often enough eventually becomes the truth. By the end of the week, the envelope on my kitchen counter had multiplied into a neat stack of certified letters thick enough to stop a door from closing. Every morning began with the metallic click of the mailbox and ended with another official notice carrying the same green Homeowners Association logo. One demanded immediate payment. Another warned about accumulating penalties. A third informed me that a lien would soon be recorded against the property if I failed to comply. The smell of fresh coffee no longer reminded me of quiet mornings by the lake. Instead, it mixed with the sharp scent of printer ink as I spread every notice across the dining room table, looking for something that actually explained why they believed they had authority over my land. There was plenty of threatening language, plenty of references to community standards, but not one original document proving their claim. Then the inconvenience became personal. My stone supplier called to apologize because his delivery truck had been stopped at the subdivision entrance. Someone claiming to represent the Homeowners Association insisted commercial vehicles needed prior approval before entering the neighborhood. 2 days later, the landscaping crew I hired received a similar warning. Electricians, scheduled to finish the outdoor lighting project, told me they had been questioned by board members who hinted that ongoing construction might violate association regulations. None of it was enough to stop the work completely, but every delay cost time, money, and patience. The strange part was how carefully everything had been orchestrated. Nobody yelled. Nobody trespassed. Nobody damaged anything. Instead, every obstacle arrived wrapped in polite language and official-looking paperwork. It felt less like a neighborhood disagreement and more like a slow-moving machine designed to wear people down until surrender seemed easier than resistance. Curious, I drove to the county recorder's office hoping the public records would settle everything in a single afternoon. The building smelled faintly of old paper, floor polish, and aging air conditioners that had probably been running since the 1980s. I spent hours reviewing plats, subdivision maps, tax records, and archived filings. The clerk helping me was friendly enough, but even she looked puzzled. "Your parcel is unusual," she admitted while scrolling through decades of digitized records. "It sits beside the subdivision, but the indexing is different." Different was not the answer I needed. I left carrying photocopies of every document I could legally request, yet the biggest question remained unanswered. That evening I returned home exhausted and found another surprise waiting near the driveway. Bright orange survey flags had appeared along the edge of my shoreline while I was gone. They stopped several feet short of the restored dock, almost as if someone was measuring future changes instead of documenting existing boundaries. I removed nothing. Instead, I photographed every flag from multiple angles before the fading sunlight disappeared behind the trees. As I stood there listening to gentle waves tapping against the dock, my phone rang. It was a title company representative I had worked with years earlier on another restoration. After hearing a brief summary of my situation, he became unusually quiet. Finally, he said something that made the cool evening air suddenly feel much heavier. Ethan, I have reviewed thousands of property files over the years, and I have learned one simple lesson. When people become this aggressive before showing you the original documents, they are usually afraid of what the original documents actually say. I looked across the darkening lake toward the mansion glowing warmly through its restored windows. For the first time since the letters began arriving, I stopped thinking about the money they wanted. I started wondering what they were trying so hard to keep me from finding. The following Monday began with a phone call I had been dreading. My bank wanted to discuss the recorded notice that had suddenly appeared during a routine title monitoring update. The loan officer spoke politely, but I could hear the careful tone professionals use when they know something has become complicated. As long as the matter remained unresolved, refinancing options would be limited, and any future line of credit for additional restoration work would almost certainly be delayed. I thanked her, hung up, and stared through the kitchen window as morning fog drifted across the lake. The mansion finally looked alive again, yet somehow it felt like I was watching someone quietly try to steal it one piece of paper at a time. I contacted an attorney recommended by another restoration contractor. After reviewing the Homeowners Association letters and the county records I had collected, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his forehead. "This is not straightforward," he admitted. "Your deed is clean, but the subdivision history is unusually fragmented. Until we locate the original governing documents, they can continue making life expensive." It was not the answer I wanted to hear. Legal research meant billable hours, and billable hours disappeared from a restoration budget faster than rainwater through a broken roof. By the time I drove home that afternoon, I found another envelope taped to my front door. This one informed me that failure to acknowledge the association's authority could result in additional administrative enforcement measures. The wording sounded official enough to intimidate almost anyone, but one sentence stood out. It repeatedly referred to the mansion as a legacy parcel. That phrase had never appeared anywhere else. Not on my deed, not on the tax records, not on the subdivision maps. I circled the words with a red pen and pinned the notice to a corkboard in my office beside every other letter they had sent. Patterns began appearing where random threats had once seemed unrelated. They never cited the same governing document twice. They quoted sections without attaching complete copies. They referenced amendments, but never identified the meetings where those amendments had supposedly been approved. It felt less like reading rules and more like reading fragments carefully selected to discourage questions. That evening I wandered through the mansion trying to clear my head. The restored hardwood floors creaked softly beneath my boots, carrying the comforting scent of fresh linseed oil and old oak. As I passed the basement staircase, my flashlight caught the edge of the concealed wall panel hiding the forgotten safe. I stood there longer than I expected. For months, it had simply been another unfinished task buried beneath dozens of higher priorities. Now it felt different. Almost every conversation since Linda appeared had revolved around history, forgotten agreements, and records from decades ago. The safe suddenly seemed less like an old piece of hardware and more like the one place nobody else had been able to rewrite. The next morning, I loaded heavy drilling equipment, specialty lock lubricant, and restoration tools into my truck instead of heading to another job site. Dust floated through the cool basement air while my work lights illuminated the thick steel door buried inside the stone foundation. My fingertips traced the rusted combination dial, worn smooth by hands that had not touched it in generations. Whatever waited behind that door had survived floods, abandoned ownership, collapsing ceilings, and 50 years of silence. Outside, another certified mail truck slowed near the mailbox. This time I did not bother walking to retrieve the envelope. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, I had the unmistakable feeling that the answers were no longer arriving through my front door. They had been waiting beneath my feet all along. The basement smelled like cold limestone, machine oil, and decades of forgotten history. Every sound echoed through the empty foundation as I positioned my work light directly over the old steel safe. Rust coated the heavy combination dial so thickly that it looked more like part of the wall than a separate piece of metal. I spent nearly 3 hours working slowly, spraying penetrating oil into every seam, warming stubborn hinges with controlled heat, and carefully freeing each frozen mechanism without damaging whatever might still be inside. My grandfather used to tell me that old locks rewarded patience instead of force. Standing there with grease covering my hands and dust settling across my boots, I realized he had been talking about more than hardware. Finally, after one last careful turn, a deep metallic click echoed through the basement. The door shifted less than half an inch before slowly swinging open under its own weight. A wave of stale air escaped, carrying the unmistakable smell of aged paper, dry leather, and cedar. There was no cash, no jewelry, and no forgotten fortune. Instead, neatly stacked inside were document tubes, leather-bound ledgers, rolled blueprints, and a small cedar box with a brass plate engraved with 2 words, Hawthorne Estate. I carried everything upstairs one careful trip at a time, afraid decades-old paper might crumble if I handled it too quickly. Sunlight filled the restored library while I spread every document across the massive oak table I had refinished months earlier. The first ledger contained construction expenses from the original development. Another held handwritten correspondence between Charles Hawthorne and county engineers. Then I opened the cedar box. Inside rested several folded maps tied together with faded blue ribbon and a sealed envelope marked original development agreements. My pulse quickened as I unfolded the largest plat map. Every lot in Pine Hollow Shores appeared neatly numbered, complete with road easements, utility corridors, and shoreline boundaries. My mansion stood on Parcel 1, unlike every surrounding property shaded in blue. To indicate homeowners association jurisdiction, Parcel 1 remained completely white. At first I thought it was a printing mistake until I compared it with another copy underneath. Identical. The mansion had never been colored with the rest of the subdivision. Attached to the map was a typed covenant dated June 19, 1974. Several paragraphs described architectural restrictions for neighborhood homes before one section immediately caught my attention. It identified Parcel 1 as a permanently independent estate excluded from all present and future homeowners association authority, assessments, mandatory membership, and common governance. The reason surprised me even more. Charles Hawthorne intended the mansion and its shoreline to remain privately controlled because future owners would be responsible for maintaining the historic boathouse, original gardens, and shoreline conservation area outside subdivision control. I read the paragraph 3 times just to convince myself I had not misunderstood it. Then another document slipped from between the pages and landed softly on the table. It was a certified county filing receipt bearing an official recording stamp from 1974. Everything had been properly recorded. Everything. Yet I had never seen this language during my search at the recorder's office. Something was missing. I immediately drove back into town carrying carefully protected copies. The same records clerk greeted me with a puzzled smile as we compared the covenant from my safe against the digitized archive. Her expression slowly changed from curiosity to disbelief. "This cannot be right," she whispered. The digital file contained the same document number, the same recording date, and the same signatures, but one entire page had vanished. The very page excluding Parcel 1 from the Homeowners Association had somehow disappeared from the county copy, while remaining perfectly preserved inside the safe beneath my mansion. In that quiet records room, surrounded by shelves filled with decades of public history, I finally understood why Linda Ashcroft never wanted to show me the original documents. She had been relying on a story that only worked because one page had quietly gone missing. I could have driven straight to an attorney and filed suit that same afternoon, but something told me moving too quickly would only give Linda time to change her story. Restoring old buildings had taught me one lesson that applied just as well to people as it did to rotten foundations. Never repair the visible crack before you understand what caused it. So I made a different decision. I stayed quiet. I placed the original covenant back inside a climate-controlled document case, ordered certified archival copies, and said nothing to the Homeowners Association. The only response I sent was a short email acknowledging receipt of their notices and requesting any additional documentation supporting their authority over Parcel 1. The answer arrived less than 24 hours later. They did not send evidence. They sent another demand for payment. Then another. Every letter became more confident than the last. Every email repeated that the mansion had always been subject to mandatory membership. Every certified notice insisted that decades of unpaid assessments remained legally enforceable. I saved every envelope without opening it immediately. I photographed every postmark, scanned every page, and organized every document by date and sender. Soon an entire wall inside my restored library was covered with carefully labeled folders connected by handwritten notes. The room smelled faintly of old books, fresh pine shelves, and printer toner, while afternoon sunlight streamed through the restored windows. Looking at that wall, I realized I was no longer collecting threats. I was collecting a timeline. Meanwhile, I hired professionals who had no connection to Pine Hollow shores. A title historian from another county examined the original covenant and confirmed the recording stamp matched authentic county records from 1974. A licensed land surveyor compared the original subdivision plat with modern parcel boundaries and reached the same conclusion. Parcel 1 had always remained legally separate. Finally, a forensic document examiner inspected both versions of the county filing. Under magnification, she identified irregular pagination that suggested the archived digital record had been created from an incomplete source rather than the original filing. She could not say when the page disappeared, but she could clearly state that the surviving document from the safe showed no signs of alteration. While the experts quietly finished their reports, Linda unknowingly kept strengthening my case. She invited me to an emergency homeowners association meeting, claiming they wanted to resolve everything peacefully. I attended without mentioning a single word about the missing page. The clubhouse smelled of fresh coffee and lemon furniture polish as board members welcomed me with carefully rehearsed smiles. Linda stood beside a projector displaying neighborhood maps that conveniently shaded my property inside the association boundaries. During the meeting, she confidently stated, in front of witnesses, that no document had ever excluded the mansion from association authority. I wrote those exact words into my notebook. Then she approved a formal board resolution authorizing additional collection efforts based on that same claim. Every board member signed the resolution before I quietly accepted my copy and thanked them for their time. Driving home beneath rows of maple trees glowing with early autumn color, I could hear dry leaves brushing across the windshield while the evening sun reflected off the calm lake beside the road. For the first time since this entire dispute began, I felt completely at peace. Linda believed she had cornered me with paperwork. She never realized that every signature she gathered, every letter she mailed, and every statement she repeated after I discovered the truth was becoming evidence that could not be explained away later. She thought silence meant surrender. In reality, silence had become the strongest part of my strategy. The hearing took place on a gray Thursday morning with steady rain tapping against the courthouse windows, the kind of slow, steady sound that makes every room feel quieter than it really is. Linda arrived carrying the same leather binder she had brought to my driveway weeks earlier. She walked into the courtroom with the relaxed confidence of someone expecting another routine collection case. The board members sat behind her, whispering to one another while neatly organized folders rested on the counsel table. I placed only one document case beside my attorney. It looked almost too small for everything that had happened. When the proceedings began, the association's attorney confidently explained that I had ignored decades of lawful assessments and refused repeated opportunities to comply with community obligations. He displayed enlarged subdivision maps that colored my mansion inside the homeowners association boundaries and referenced the same incomplete covenant that had appeared in the county archive. Then the judge asked the simplest question of the entire morning. Do you possess the original governing documents? The room became noticeably quieter. Linda nodded toward her attorney, who answered that the county archive represented the official record. My attorney stood, walked calmly to the evidence table, and placed the original document case in front of the judge. Even from where I sat, I could hear the soft click of its brass latch opening. One by one, the original plat maps, certified filing receipt, handwritten correspondence, and complete covenant were carefully removed. Finally, the missing page rested on top of the stack. Fresh copies were handed to every attorney in the room. Linda reached for hers with complete confidence. That confidence disappeared before she reached the bottom of the page. Her expression froze. The judge read silently for several moments before asking the county records supervisor to compare the original against the archived version already admitted into evidence. The supervisor adjusted her glasses, examined both documents side by side, and slowly looked up. "Your Honor, the archived copy is missing an entire recorded page." Nobody spoke. The only sound came from rain striking the courthouse windows. My title historian testified next, explaining that Parcel 1 had always existed outside Homeowners Association jurisdiction. The licensed surveyor confirmed the original subdivision design intentionally separated the mansion from every restricted lot. The forensic document examiner explained that the archived version had been reproduced from an incomplete source, while the original document showed continuous age, matching paper fibers, authentic recording stamps, and no signs of alteration. Then my attorney introduced something Linda had completely forgotten about. Every certified demand letter, every board resolution, every email, every signed statement made after I requested proof of authority. The courtroom projector displayed her own words one after another, each one repeating that no document had ever excluded the property. Those statements now stood beside the original covenant, proving exactly the opposite. The judge leaned back, folded his hands, and looked directly toward the association's table. This court finds no legal basis for mandatory membership, assessments, liens, or collection activity against Parcel 1. He ordered the recorded lien immediately released, declared every assessment unenforceable, and required the Homeowners Association to reimburse my documented legal expenses. Before ending the hearing, he directed that the complete record be forwarded for additional administrative review concerning the discrepancies surrounding the archived filing and the association's collection efforts. As people slowly gathered their papers, Linda remained seated, staring at the missing page that had quietly survived inside an old basement safe, while every version she relied upon had left it behind. The envelope she mailed to intimidate me had become the first piece of evidence that unraveled everything she believed could never be questioned. 3 weeks later, the mansion finally felt like a home instead of a courtroom exhibit. The first cool breeze of autumn carried the clean scent of the lake through the open windows, while sunlight reflected across the restored hardwood floors exactly the way I had imagined during those long nights, when the place was still filled with broken plaster and leaking ceilings. Every contractor had been paid. Every borrowed tool had been returned. The orange survey flags disappeared from the shoreline, and no more certified letters arrived in my mailbox. The silence that settled over the property was different now. It no longer felt abandoned. It felt earned. A few days after the hearing, the county recorder contacted me with confirmation that the lien had been officially released from the property records. Shortly afterward, the Homeowners Association delivered reimbursement for the legal expenses ordered by the court. The envelope looked strangely familiar. Same weight, same expensive paper, same official logo. Only this time, instead of demanding money, it represented the cost of a mistake they never expected to make. I placed it beside the original notice that had started everything. They looked almost identical until you understood the story behind each one. Neighbors who had quietly watched from a distance during the restoration slowly began stopping by. Some brought homemade pie. Others simply wanted to see the mansion that everyone believed would never be saved. Several admitted they had questioned Homeowners Association decisions for years, but assumed nobody could ever challenge them successfully. I always gave them the same answer. I did not defeat anyone because I argued louder. I simply refused to stop looking for the original truth. A month later, I returned to the basement carrying a custom display case. The old steel safe remained exactly where Charles Hawthorne had installed it more than 50 years earlier. I left it there. Some things belong exactly where history placed them. Upstairs, in the restored library, I framed 3 documents side by side. The original 1974 covenant with the missing page restored. The certified recording receipt proving it had always existed. And the very first assessment notice demanding 52 years of dues. Visitors often ask why I keep that notice instead of throwing it away. I smile every time because without that envelope, I might never have opened the safe. Without opening the safe, the missing page might have remained forgotten for another 50 years. Sometimes the greatest mistake your opponent makes is handing you the reason to uncover the truth. Every evening, I still walk down the cedar dock just before sunset. The boards creak softly beneath my boots, the same comforting sound I heard on the day I drove the final screw into the railing. Loons drift across the calm water. Pine trees sway gently along the shoreline. The mansion stands quietly behind me, no longer hidden beneath vines or surrounded by rumors. It simply belongs where it has always belonged. Looking back, I realized the fight was never really about an old bill or a homeowners association. It was about the difference between records that survive because they are convenient and records that survive because someone cared enough to preserve them. Charles Hawthorne protected that truth inside a basement safe. I was simply the person who finally turned the handle. The house taught me something I will never forget. Wood can rot, stone can crack, paper can disappear, but the truth has a remarkable habit of waiting patiently for the right person to find it. Justice is not loud. It does not arrive with flashing lights or dramatic speeches. Sometimes it arrives in the quiet click of an old lock opening after half a century, reminding everyone that facts do not become fiction simply because they have been ignored.